Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Canaan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good afternoon, friends. Hope everybody's having a fantastic Memorial weekend. Good family time, good rest and relaxation. My weekend is off to a fairly eventful start. You know, you have to be really careful what you promise. You got to really think about what you promise. So, you know, Joy, as you guys know, went to North Carolina State. She graduated with her master's in clinical mental health counseling. There are 28 people in her cohort, and of that 28, about 4 or 5 are really close, and then they're really close with 2 or 3 graduates from the year above her. And she calls them her friend group, and they do something really cool. They travel around the country. They go to Airbnbs, and, you know, they're in Nashville, then they're in Washington, D.C., and they're all over the place. And so some time ago, she said, "Hey, Dad, I think your place would be great for our friend group to take a trip. What do you think?" And so I agreed to it, but without thinking about it. You know, she's like, "You know, of course we don't want you here. It's our friend group, right?" So, you know, you agree, you do certain things for your kids, you're not even thinking about it. And the next thing you know, Anitra and I are in an Airbnb. Our kids are at the house. And then, of course, Anitra's like, "Well, we've got to have Angelina come by and clean the house." So next thing you know, you're out $1,000 just for your kids to have a fun time at an Airbnb at your house. So something doesn't feel right with that picture, but they're over there barbecuing up a storm, having a great time. You know, we're at an Airbnb, and it's on the lake. It's beautiful. And I had a rather eventful yesterday because I was gardening like crazy, trying to get out of the house. And I've never said this before, but I'm allergic to a lot of stuff, especially bee stings. And I'm supposed to have the EpiPen with me at all times. So something bit me and I broke out and all this stuff. So yeah, yesterday was rather eventful as I hung out. I didn't go to the emergency room, but I did go to urgent care. And got all the medication. So I'm in a good place now. Everything's good. Once again, maybe God knew I just needed a little peaceful time. Anitra and I get away right on the water, and it's all good. So today's going to be quick and brief because I love it here, but the internet's not great, and I'm a little concerned it's going to cut me off. So we have a question from a listener that Lisa and I are going to answer. Mary from the great state of South Dakota, and she wants to know, why is it when she does research on highly selective schools, it seems like they have more students from the local area than from afar? Is an advantage to be from the local area at a highly selective school? So we're going to unpack that. Then I have a brand new interview. It'll be a 3-parter. It's a fun one for me to do because it's a friend. We've known each other for 23 years. His name's John Hoffman, and he's been in education for 45 years. He started 3 nonprofits, community-based organizations, and he's been either doing college placement, boarding, or K-12 placement since 1980. And we were just having a conversation, and I just thought he was just bequeathing a lot of pearls of wisdom on me in that conversation. I was like, "Hey, John, how'd you feel about coming on the podcast and sharing a lot of these insights?" And then on top of that, he's an older dad, but his second child just went through the college process this year. And so he has a lot of interesting perspectives going from placement to dad, although his son graduated 8 years ago, so it's not the second time, not the first time he's been through it, but he's noticed a lot of changes even in the last 8 years. So John will be sharing just a lot of insights on a lot of topics. He's a pretty engaging guy. I think you're going to really enjoy it. So that'll be our interview over the next 3 weeks. And friends, we just have one announcement for today, and that is Lisa and Linda's presentation is 3 days away, and that's if you're hearing it on Monday. It's Thursday, May 30th at 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central, 6:30 Mountain, 5:30 Pacific's our first one ever via webinar. And it looks like it's going to smash our record for the most attendees ever. And, I've learned something, friends, about our audience, and that is you guys are a lot like college applicants. If you talk to any admission professional, they'll tell you around 50%, if not more, of the applications come in within 3 days of the deadline. And that's the way all of our events are, too. The masses all sign up within the last 3 days, but we've got a really large number signed up already. So we'd love to have you join us. Just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com, click the events tab, and you'll see it there. It'll say Serenity Now, Strategies for Parents to Calm the College Admissions Process. Hope to see you Thursday at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific. Without any further ado, let's transition to Mary from South Dakota and her question that Lisa and I tackle next.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Lisa, this is, I think, our third question in a row that I've really, really liked from Mary from South Dakota.
Yeah.
We don't get a lot of questions from South Dakota, so Mary, send us some more questions and tell your friends to send them in. Let's play the question and tell me your thoughts.
Hi, Mark and team. This is Mary from South Dakota. I've spent the last couple of years touring every possible school you can think of with my daughter, including some of the very selective schools that people are all trying to get in. And I noticed that these very selective schools tend to have a larger percentage of admitted students from their local area. So an example would be Yale is in New Haven, Connecticut. I noticed a lot of kids from New Haven, Connecticut. Another example would be University of Pennsylvania. I noticed a lot of kids there from Philadelphia or from, nearby New Jersey. Another example would be Rice. Rice told us that 40% of their students are from the state of Texas. And I noticed just anecdotally in talking with students that a large percentage of them are from the Houston area. Finally, Stanford. Stanford is one of the most highly selective schools and has a tiny, tiny percentage admission rate, but a large, large percentage of kids going there from California. Maybe I want to say about 60% of the kids we met at Admitted Students Day were from California and about half of those from the Bay Area. So I realize it's easier to attract kids from your local area. They're more likely to attend. They're more likely to come do tours and do Admitted Students Day. But there's got to be more to it than that. Are these schools intentionally admitting students from their local area to create goodwill with the community? Do these local communities have feeder schools into these elite institutions? Is it children of faculty? Is it legacy kids? What's going on? Or am I just imagining things? Because it seems to me like if you want to go to Princeton, it might help you to be from New Jersey. Any comments you have would be appreciated. And thank you so much for your show. I love it. Fantastic show.
Well, I thought the irony here is that Mary and her child are from South Dakota. And I'm guessing that, of all the people who were at those visits that of these IVs and these very selective schools, that Mary's child had the best geographic opportunity of any of the kids, because they're really trying to recruit people from states that are not common. And then, I think that Mary is worried that there's so many students from the surrounding areas that they'll have an advantage. I think they might have a disadvantage because there are so many of them.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Let me start by saying something Karen Christoph said when she met with a bunch of our listeners, and she's been at 5 schools. And she said, every school I've been at, it's always been the Dakotas have always been the hardest ones. We'd be at 47 or 48 states. So, there are a lot of states that are tough: Idaho, Wyoming, Alaska. Some people find Arkansas, Louisiana can be really difficult depending on where they're located. But those Dakota states are very small. Montana's another one. I agree 100% with you. But I also understand why she's perplexed and baffled by this question. She had a lot of the answers in what she said at the very end when she went down her laundry list of all the possibilities. Because she's absolutely right. If you look at who's at UPenn, you're going to see a lot of Philly. You know, if you look at Chicago, you'll see a lot of Chicago. She mentioned Yale. You'll see a lot of New Haven. She mentioned Rice. And 40% from Texas, large constituency from Houston. And she mentioned Stanford, 60% California. And I don't know if this number is right, but she thought as many as 50% from the Bay Area. That feels a little high, but you're going to have an overrepresentation from the Bay Area. Now, the one thing I disagree with it was at the end when she said, so if you want to go to Princeton, maybe it's best to live in New Jersey. No. So what's going on here? Well, several things. And like I said, she had a lot of the answers when she went down her laundry list of was it this, was it that, was it this, was it that? And you can look at this up in LinkedIn because you can go into LinkedIn, you can see where graduates end up working from each school. The majority of time, the number one employer is the college itself. Now, it's not the majority of people. Maybe 5% of people that graduate from a college end up working for the college, but that's higher than any other employer. So you're going to have an inordinate number of several categories right around the school. You're going to have an inordinate number of graduates that end up working at the school. You're going to have an inordinate number of faculty kids. And keep something in mind with faculty kids. And a lot of times this also, depending on the school, can apply to staff and administrators as well. A lot of times there's tuition perquisite results that they get. I mean, I've worked with many faculty kids that get tuition perquisite deals at their college. And there's also an exchange network for other colleges as well that's out there. So in addition to getting a faculty perquisite is a discount that your kid pays to go to the college, like maybe 75% discount, depending on the school and the wealth of the school and the resource of the school. So just the fact that you're getting a discount to go, that in of itself, you're going to have a lot more applicants, the financial aspect. But in addition to that, not all schools, because this isn't true for the UCs, but for most schools, being a faculty kid is considered a hooked applicant. It's an extra thumb on the scale. And if you're talking about even mid-sized schools, like the biggest expense for schools is faculty salaries, faculty, staff, administration salaries, and benefits. It's and she's talking about selective schools. Selective schools have low student-teacher ratios. So they have a lot of people there potentially that can have kids. So one is faculty is going to be higher, or staff, or administrators' kids. And I've already said two reasons they may want to apply. One is extra thumb on the scale, easier to get in. Secondly, discounted pricing.
And another reason is just the comfort that comes from living locally and the familiarity that breeds and the trust that builds. Not everybody wants to do the adventuresome thing and go away for college.
I mentioned the fact that a lot of people work for the school, employees of the school. You also have more alum. I mean, I look at both of my kids. So Karis graduated from Davidson, which is 19 miles from Charlotte. She lived in the Charlotte area she graduated class of 2018. She lived in the Charlotte area for the first 4 years after graduating, and now she's in Durham. So she's still in North Carolina. She just, moved a couple hours down the other part of the state. Joy specifically picked NC State. I mean, they had an amazing, K-CREP accredited program in her field. That was part of it. But she looked at all the other options that had that really strong program in her field. One was UGA, one was Florida State, one was Vanderbilt, North Carolina A&T. Just looking, there was like maybe another one I can't remember. And she said, and Lisa, you even gave this advice in talking to her. You're probably going to end up living where you get your master's. So think long and hard about that.
Right.
So that was the single biggest reason why she picked, North Carolina State. I mean, she did love the program, but, and she also considered UNC Charlotte too. That's right. But she was like, where do I want to live? And it's interesting because there are 28 people in her cohort, and 26 of those 28 are working in the research triangle. So why am I saying this? You're going to have a high percentage of alumni that live in the area. And then there's a lot of alumni marriages. I mean, how many times do we see, at least in working with the client, and we go down and, we have a question, we ask where they went to school in our questionnaire, not because we're trying to be nosy, but we're looking at things like that. Oh, there might be a legacy opportunity here. I was just looking at, was one with you recently.
Yeah.
Yeah, and both of them went to Grinnell, right?
Right.
And I could look and say, Grinnell, I think I know where they met. So why I'm saying this is you have a lot of double alum. And then a lot of times, if it's, and it sounds like she's talking about a lot of selective schools, because look at all the examples throughout. She threw out Stanford, she threw out Rice, she threw out UPenn, and she threw out Yale. And she also said, I've been visiting these schools that everybody's trying to get in. She mentioned that. So you can argue back and forth how much of this is nature, how much of this is nurture. But I have seen over the years that kids whose parents went to these high-powered schools, they tend to be really, really strong.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to be really, really strong. And I'm not an expert enough to know how much of that was genetics versus just they were able to give their kids every imaginable opportunity. It's probably a combination of both. But in fact, I really think sometimes Harvard gets a little bit of a bad rap because I'll hear people say the acceptance rate for Harvard alum was like 29%. That's ridiculous. And the reason why I think that gets a little bit of bad rap, over the years, going back to my time at Westtown and since Westtown, I have seen some really, really, really strong Harvard alumni get in.
Mm-hmm.
Really strong. And so you have a cluster of more alum, sometimes double alum, and their kids are going to be strong.
Right.
And they're more likely to use early decision and use early methods because there's a level of savviness there. A lot of times they've been successful in their careers and financially they're able to do that kind of thing. And so and then there's one other thing, which I did mention, which is really, really important. And I mentioned this not too long ago on a podcast. A lot of these schools do have a special commitment to their backyard. Like Penn has a special commitment to West Philadelphia and to just really Philadelphia City, especially if you go to public schools. And I've seen a number of kids that I've worked with over the years that I felt like that's really what helped them to get in. They would get into Penn and not get into less selective schools like on a pretty regular basis. And Chicago has some of the same commitments as well with Northwestern and UChicago, especially for the public schools in their area. Boston, some of the selective schools in Boston have those backyard commitments. And so when you combine it all together and you realize just how many alumni live there and they know the school, that's what's good. It's a classic example of how statistics can be deceiving.
Right.
I've just been rambling and yapping away. What else do you want to add, Lisa?
Well, and I think that you make a lot of really good points that in some ways there might be some advantages to being local if you're an alumni or a child of alumni or a child of faculty or involved in one of the special programs. I kind of think, I don't have scientific evidence for that. I kind of think South Dakota trumps all of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure she knows. I'm sure she knows that is a plus, but it's a really good question. Like, why do I see such and it feels like a large number? Like, it'd be one thing if it's like, maybe a little more, but the number is significantly more coming from the local area. And I think that it's probably a question that a lot of people, when they heard it, they probably like, yeah, why? Because some of these numbers can be quite high. That come from the area. And once again, it's not just faculty. I know, I'll just use Emory, for example, because they're a local selective private school close to me. And they put an extra thumb on the scale for not just for faculty, but they also do look at staff as well. So that ends up being a big number. So I think what would be helpful is if you could compare how many alum actually live in the area, how many alum actually apply, how many alum actually apply early, how many double alum apply, and how many of those alum are really strong. I can assure you the school does not want to take too many from one place or one group. But those are a lot of institutional priorities. If you've got a local commitment to your area, your faculty, your staff, you apply ED, your double legacy, you may be double. And then keep in mind, why is it that schools like legacy? Well, the two biggest sources of money are tuition and philanthropic contributions. And philanthropic contributions, alumni give at a higher rate than the population at large. So we're just using alumni, but a lot of those alumni are also alumni/donor. And even if you're not given the 7 or 8 figure gift, there's a whole bunch of schools that differentiate between alumni that just can check a box and say, I'm an alumni versus active alumni. Some schools rate their alumni and have very behind closed doors. They don't talk about it, but a whole rating system for their alum. And their alum are graded and rated based on things like whether they've actively attended, reunions and get involved in volunteerism, or do they give regularly, even if it's not a big gift.
Yeah.
And so go ahead. You're going to say something?
Yeah, I was just saying, I think at a place like Duke, I've heard that they look at the parents, not just for what you've donated, but have you volunteered for the school since you've been out? Have you worked at events in your area? That kind of gives them a higher alumni score.
It does. Duke is one of the places that has a secret alumni score that they don't publicize. And they do. They look at length of involvement. And you don't just score points by donating. Right. There's other ways but they did make that differentiation. And then these are savvy, a lot of times these are savvy families from a young age, if they had a good experience, where they're thinking, I would kind of like my kid to go to this school. So they're doing all of those things. And so, but even then I mentioned that some schools have a commitment to their local area. A lot of times what I see with that is it's to the public schools in their area.
Right.
So that's a factor as well. So I think we've covered the main ones, alumni, more donors, staff, faculty, a super high percentage of people living in the area, and then that commitment. But great question, Mary from South Dakota. Keep them coming. Thanks, Lisa.
Oh, my pleasure.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 1 of my interview with John Hoffman, John starts out by sharing his background. John shares why a Jewish man from New York wants to work with Black and Brown and Asian kids. John talks about how the college process is radically different now than it was 50 years ago or even 10 years ago. And John tells a story about a course he took at Columbia that had a profound impact on him and his understanding of human nature, and how it still impacts his understanding of human behavior today. And then finally, John explains what he means by having a T20 mentality. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I am really excited today. I have a friend of mine who I've known for 23 years. He and his family have even hosted our whole family for Thanksgiving 20 years ago. Welcome to the Your College Bound Kid podcast, John Hoffman.
Happy to be here, Mark. Thank you.
Well, John is someone, listeners like Dave, that we just talk a lot on the phone all the time. And we were having a conversation recently about a range of issues related to college admissions. And I was like, John, our listeners would love this. Would you be willing to come on? And so you're like, who's this John Hoffman? So, John, without any further ado, why don't you share your backstory so our listeners will know the context from which you'll speak?
Sure, be happy to. Thank you, Mark. I am a graduate of the George School in Newtown, Pennsylvania, class of 1973. After George School, I attended Oberlin College for 2 years in Oberlin, Ohio. Took 2 years off and finished up at Columbia, graduated from Columbia in 1979. with a double major in psychology and theater. After Oberlin, I worked as a sports writer for SportsWise New York Magazine. I then transitioned over to PepsiCo in Westchester, where I was the associate manager of communications programs, responsible for running two of their national youth sports programs. One was called Mobile Tennis, and one was called Pepsi Hot Shot. Pepsi Hot Shot was linked to the NBA, and Mobile Tennis was linked to the departments of recreation for major cities all over the country. After working at Pepsi for 2 years, I created an organization called the Albert G. Oliver Program, which was designed to place high-achieving Black and Latino youth from New York City who are also from very low-income backgrounds into leading independent day and boarding schools, and those kids then ended up going on to leading colleges and universities. The Oliver program also provided our students with paying summer jobs every summer at a multiplicity of places, including places like J.P. Morgan, Debevoise and Plimpton, the mayor's office, architectural firms, engineering firms, what have you. So the kids had paying summer jobs every summer. They also had to do meaningful community service, 40 hours per year over their 4 years of high school before they ended up graduating and going on to college. Oliver, I would say, ended up graduating close to 99% of their kids from high school and from college. It was a rather remarkable success story. It was very powerful work, and I loved every minute of it. After 14 years, a new challenge emerged from the Oliver program. The program and the board had decided to commission a survey of the work that we were doing, and then they ended up interviewing all of the different folks that we work with. And what came out of the review was that Oliver was doing everything it needed to do for its students and parents. But what was missing was the independent schools themselves were not providing enough support for their kids of color. I then felt, well, here is a new initiative for me to jump into. So I left Oliver at that point. I created a new not-for-profit called the Independent Teaching Project, which placed teachers of color in many of those same independent schools that we were working with. After 4 years of running the Independent Teaching Project, I missed working with young people. A job opened up at De La Salle Academy in New York, which was an independent school, grades 6 through 8, for mostly high-achieving, low-income kids, mostly kids of color. And I ran their high school placement program for 18 years, and that's where I met you, Mark, when you were over at the Westtown School, and I met Susan when she was the director of college counseling there. After doing high school placement at De La Salle, I decided to create another not-for-profit called Go to College NYC, which was doing the same work as the Oliver program, but instead of recruiting kids out of the middle schools and placing them in prep school, Go to College New York City was recruiting students out of the large, underserved public high schools and big Catholic high schools in the city of New York and helping them go to college. Go to College New York City, I ran that for 5 years until it went belly up. It was very hard to raise money during COVID. And so the organization went under, but during the time that I was at Go to College, I probably placed over 200 kids. At De La Salle, I placed over 1,000. At Oliver, I placed over 500. So I probably work with close to 1,800 students and families in my different incarnations, in this area. In the DEI spectrum. Today, I am a senior advisor at the Oliver Scholars Program, the same program that I created back in 1980. So I've had a couple of decades working in the sphere, and I can tell you that the work that I did, or even at the time that I was applying to college, was a universe away for what's happening today. I mean, there is such a difference in disparity of experiences from when I first applied to college to what's going on today. It's remarkably different.
So, John, couple things.
John is youthful, and he sounds youthful. Can I tell people you're about to turn 70, John? Am I allowed to say that? Or you want me to edit that out?
No, it's fine, Mark. I am who I am.
So, and here's the great thing. John talked about working in tennis and, decades ago. He still gets out multiple times a week and plays tennis. That's his passion as a hobby. But I want to ask you a question. You're like a Jewish guy from New York. Where's this passion for working with Black and Latino under-resourced, gifted and talented kids come from?
Well, it's a great question, Mark, because the passion for doing this work in the DEI space almost happened by accident. I very much loved my education at the George School. And when I graduated from George School and when I graduated from college, I knew I wanted to give back to George School. And I immediately started giving money every year and returning for alumni days. And I reached out to the director of admissions, who at the time was Barry Kopic. And I said to him, Barry, I'm in New York City. I'm doing some exciting work at PepsiCo, but I have some extra time. Is there anything I can do to help George School? And he said, well, John, yes, there is, because we get a lot of inquiries from New York, but a lot of those inquiries do not translate into formal applications. So what I'd like to do is to mail you, because there was no email back then, I'd like to snail mail you some postcards from folks who actually filled them out and sent them to George School asking for more information. We then sent the family an application, but we haven't heard back from them. And we would like to convert a lot of these inquiries into formal applications. So I said, sure, I'm happy to help you out with that. So he sent me the information in the mail every week. He'd send me a new, big manila folder full of these cards with inquiries from New York. And I would pick up my phone and old rotary black telephone, and I would call them and introduce myself as a George School graduate or just a George School alum.
Hey, John, why don't you tell people a little bit about George? Because you know George, I know George, Susan knows George. Most 99% of people don't know anything about George.
Well, sure. George School is a 4-year boarding school in Newtown, Pennsylvania, in Bucks County. It's a Quaker school. And that's a really important facet of the institution, because Quakers believe very strongly in I think, all the important things that we should be believing in. They're against war. They were the first ones to support voting rights for women, voting rights for blacks. They were responsible for the Underground Railroad, bringing slaves and people of color from the South to the North. Their hearts have always been in the right places with, I think, just about every important issue that we faced with as a society here in the United States, and certainly in terms of equality and equity and inclusion and voting rights and things of that nature. The Quakers also believe very strongly that as important as it is to do right by ourselves and our family, it is equally important to do rights by other people, that we have an intrinsic responsibility to use our talents to help others, especially the less fortunate. And that's something that they talk about constantly. So I learned about that every day when I was at the George School. So when Barry Kopic asked me to help out with this venture in New York City, I was happy to do it. A year into the volunteer work that I was doing at the George School, Barry called me and he said, we have a new head of school. His name is David Borns. And David is coming to George School from the Oakwood School, where he was a head of the Oakwood School, and he would like to meet the young alumni who are actively involved in the school. And I gave him your name and told him what you were doing, and he would like to meet you. So I said, sure. I always welcome the opportunity to jump in the car and visit George School. So I jumped in the car, drove down to George School, and I met David Borns, and he thanked me for the work that I was doing in the admissions area. And then he said to me, John, we're a Quaker school. And when I look around this school as a head of the school, over 95% of our school are white kids. And we have like 5% at most kids of color. And we have close to $500,000 a year left over in our financial aid budget. And frankly, this is wrong. As a Quaker school, we should be offering a George School education to children of all races, all ethnicities, all backgrounds, all cultures, and all financial needs. And then he threw out the big question to me. He said, you're in New York City. There must be lots of Black and Latino kids who could benefit from a George School education. Do you think you could help us find some of them? And I think David was throwing this question out at everybody that was coming into his office. And I kind of picked up the ball and I said, yeah, I think I can help you with this. Because I was in a great place at PepsiCo working with these recreators that were running the New York City mobile tennis program all over the city in all 5 boroughs. So he said, well, see what you can do and get back to us. So I talked to the recreators who are running the Pepsi mobile tennis program. I told them about the possibility of a scholarship every year at the George School for a Black or Latino student.
So, John, you said earlier you can't believe how much the process has changed after you mentioned you probably work with 1,900 kids. Why don't you mention how you've become convinced that it's changed, and anything you want to share at all on how it feels very different today than it felt when you were doing this decades ago?
Sure. Well, the first thing that was different was when I applied to college. Now, when I applied to college, this was back in 1973, there was no internet. There was no email. There were no cell phones. There were no podcasts. There were no stand-up computers like this. I don't even think there were any computers. So when you wanted to apply to college, after you met with your college counselor and you have a list of schools that you wanted to look at, and that was usually a list of maybe 6, 8 at the most. Once you had your list, you had to either snail mail the college and say, hi, my name is John Hoffman. I'd like to apply to Oberlin. Can you send me an application? Or you pick up the phone and you would call the college and you would ask for the admissions office. Then you would ask them to snail mail you an application. Once the application arrived, Mark, this is a paper application.
Oh, yeah, John, because you know what else wasn't around in 1973? The Common App.
There was
the
no
Common App started in 75 with 15 schools.
There was no Common App. So we would receive an application in the mail. The first thing we would do would be making Xerox copies of it. We would then complete the Xerox copies in pencil until they were perfected. If there were mistakes, we would erase it, we would make changes. And then when we had the Xerox copy perfect in pencil, we would then put it into a IBM Selectric typewriter and type out the responses that we had put on the Xerox paper. So as you can well imagine, the time that went into doing each and every one of these applications, it was incredible. It took hours. So most students back then in 73 were perhaps applying to anywhere between 5 and 8 colleges. It was unheard of that you applied to more because you just didn't have the time and it was just too labor intensive. Jump ahead to to the time of the Common Application. The kids that I worked with the Oliver program did use the Common Application. But I think what was very different back then in the 90s when I was working with kids to what I see today is just, number one, the enormous number of applications that colleges are receiving. I think back then, a lot of the highly selective schools were accepting 20, 30% of their applicants. Today, they're accepting 3 to 5% of their applicants. You also hear the expression pointy. Colleges are looking for that kid who has everything, plus they have that big pointy feature, which kind of puts them over the top at a lot of schools. That was not an issue back in the day when I was working with kids in the 90s. I mean, of course, colleges were still looking at athletes and favoring them. They were also favoring legacies, and they were favoring children of employees, but that didn't impact any of the Oliver scholars. When I recruited kids, I never recruited athletes. I had no idea who was athletic. They were just really brainy kids of great character. So I had very, very few kids, Mark, that were going to be athletic recruits. I didn't have any kids that were legacies. And I didn't, most of my kids were first gen kids. And I didn't have any kids that were children of professors or employees at the universities. So that kind of framework never came into play with the Oliver Scholars, but they still did remarkably well in the college process.
Yeah, John, just to get a sense of how the selectivity's changed a little, just give our listeners a feel for like around how many Oliver Scholars would have gone to places like Penn, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, places like that, compared to what you're seeing now.
Sure. Well, again, this was in the early 90s. I started, my kids in bigger numbers started going to college, I think, in 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94 through 98. My last class was a class of the high school class of 94, so the college class of 98. Over that span of time, I worked with probably close to 500 kids. I would say 50% of them ended up at 5 colleges. They ended up at Harvard, Columbia, Brown, UPenn, and Wesleyan. Literally 50% of the 500 Oliver Scholars that I ended up placing in college went to those 5 schools. I also had, a fair number going to Duke and a fair number going to all the other Ivies, very few to Dartmouth, very few to Princeton, fair number to Cornell. And I had a lot of kids going to some of the smaller liberal arts colleges, going to Swarthmore, going to Haverford, going to Oberlin, going to Vassar. I had a bunch going to Stanford. So, they were pretty much, some of the finest colleges in the country that the kids were matriculating into. I did not have a whole lot of kids going to state schools. I had a handful going to Binghamton in New York. But for the most part, they were going to the top universities and liberal arts colleges. But today's process is very different. And it's obviously much more competitive. And Oliver is, I doubt very much that Oliver or Prep for Prep or any of the other organizations that we're familiar with can boast those same kinds of numbers of placements just because we're living in a different admissions universe today than we did in the 90s. No question.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that a little bit more later. John has many times in talking to him told me about one course he took when he was at Columbia that had a profound impact on his life. I'm going to ask you 2 questions at once here, John. One, tell our listeners a little bit about the course and why it was so profound in your sort of understanding of human behavior. And what can our listeners learn about this course and how it relates to the college admission process? Because that was a conversation we had, 3 or 4 months ago, and I thought that's so insightful. Why don't you share that?
Well, firstly, let me backtrack a little bit. I was a psych major at Oberlin, and I read a lot of Freud, and I was fascinated by Freud. And one of Freud's theories was the idea of the defense mechanism. The idea behind the defense mechanism is that we intrinsically, innately, have internal mechanisms to protect ourselves from hurt and harm to our psyches and to our person. Jump ahead to my going to Columbia, where I took a course, Sociology 101. And in Sociology 101, we learned about the defense mechanism in a different way, in a sociological way, and it was called attribution theory. And it's a very simple concept, and it jibes totally with Freud's idea of a defense mechanism. What attribution theory says is that when we do well, when we are successful, let's say a young person is a senior in high school and they earn an A on a test, or they get a 4 or 5 on an AP exam, or they're elected captain of their sports team, or they are honored by being elected to be the president of the student council, or take it one step further, they are accepted to several of their top choice colleges. They attribute that success to what? To themselves, because I am smart, because I worked hard, because I'm really good at these things. And you puff out your chest and you take ownership of these wonderful successes. Conversely, when you think about Freud's defense mechanism and attribution theory, when things happen to us that aren't so wonderful, when we don't get an A on a paper, when we don't do well on an AP examination, when we aren't selected by our peers to be the captain of a team, when we aren't selected in our prep schools to be a prefect, or we're not elected to the student council, or we're not honored in a way that we really feel we deserve to be, and then jumping to the present, we don't get into the colleges that we fully felt we deserve to get into, we don't own it. We point fingers everywhere else. Well, I didn't get in because the teachers that wrote rec letters didn't write a good enough rec letter for me. I didn't get in because the college didn't see the real me. I didn't get in because I had a bad day when I took the SAT or the ACT. I didn't get in because, on my common application essay, I should have written about X instead of writing about Y. So people don't own.
So, John, let me just go a step further. What I see, I agree 100% with everything you're saying. But what I see is people going to that next step of because somebody took my spot. So, because it's sort of because I'm not an athlete, like name drop.
Oh, well, yeah.
Because I'm not a first gen kid, because I'm not black or brown. I mean, this is what I see.
Yeah, I mean, part of that whole attribution theory, and you can go on and on and on and on about all the reasons you didn't get in, and let's add all those other things. So I've got an A average and a 1500, and another kid has got an A minus average and a 1450, and they got in and I didn't get in. Well, I'm going to say, well, they got in because they're a person of color. Or the other kid gets in and I don't get in. Well, they got in because they're an athlete.
Or a donor.
There are all or they got in because they're first gen, or they got in because they're low income, but nobody talks about the opposite when you talk about the fact that the legacy kid gets in, right? The legacy kid gets in because they have connections, okay? The kid whose parents have a lot of money, they get in because they're seen as a potential donor to the university. Colleges, basically, as you know, and you've talked about this constantly, they accept on institutional needs. What do we need to round out this class? Do we need an oboe player? Because the senior oboe player is graduating from the school. Do we need a new point guard for the basketball team? Do we need someone who's going to major in German because the department is depleted and there aren't enough kids majoring in German?
John, I'll give you one more subtle. It's not a clear direct, but we need a lot of net tuition revenue in order to pay our bills. So we're going to go to filling your school, Scarsdale or private school this, or, we're going to recruit heavily because from these schools because we know there are people that can pay. And as a result of that, I'm taking a trip every year to that school. And now I'm super comfortable and familiar with that school. I know the counselor, I know the curriculum, I know. And so there's inherent advantages in that because a lot of people will hear what you say and say, guess what? I'm not the oboe player. I'm not the point guard. So that doesn't relate to me. But there can be a denial of, well, you were in a very privileged setting. And that's one reason why you get so many visitors there. And then those visitors get a comfort level. And it's listen, doesn't mean you're not outstanding, but I still think it's an application of what you're talking about.
Right. I happen to either read something or hear a podcast involved with Christoph Gutentag, the dean of admissions at Duke. And he basically said, look, what people don't understand is that the kids that are applying here, I know that they are the best of the best in their high school. And they're expecting that we are going to see that and offer them admission. But what we're seeing in our applicant pool is every kid that we're seeing is the best of the best from their high school. And they all have 4.0s and they all have 1500s and they all write well. So the point is, what do they have in their application that knocks my socks off? That was the expression, and that's the pointy thing. That's that thing that distinguishes one kid from another in their applicant pool. And each school is looking for different things, and some schools are looking for the same thing. But the bottom line is that we have to own the good stuff, Mark, and we have to own the stuff that's not as good. When good things happen, we own it. When things that aren't perfect, we have to basically say, you know what? Congrats to these other kids. I still got some wonderful offers. I'm going to choose among the schools that are valuing me. And I'm going to focus on the colleges that accepted me, that are valuing me, as opposed to being, inundated with emotions about the schools that didn't take me. It's not the prom. Okay, that's not what we're talking about here.
John, this whole thing we're talking about was bothering me last year because I just don't like it when I'm talking to my families and they start putting down the kid that got in, that the clear implication is not as good as my kid, but you would not believe who they took. They took blah, blah, and I've heard it all. Every single imaginable bucket you can think of, I've heard it, right? They want first gen. It could be all of them. I've heard it all. And so I reached out to Susan, who John knows Susan well. Susan and I served with John as board members at Go to College, New York City, but John's known Susan for a couple decades before that as well. And so I reached out to Susan as one of my mentors. I'm like, Susan, I need your help. And she helped me because she said, and she wasn't excusing it. There's a difference between excusing and helping you to understand. So she said, don't you find when you're watching a basketball game and somebody doesn't like the way it goes, they blame the ref? It's kind of human nature, that self-protective mechanism. It's a lot more painful emotionally to just say maybe someone was a better fit for that institution than I was. It's a lot easier emotionally to say, if the system was fair, my kid would have got in.
Exactly. No. I mean, I think that really does sum it up. And we don't really know exactly what each and every school is focusing on in their ED1 and their ED2 and their EA and then in their regular decision pools. We have no idea what they're looking for and what they need. And I think when you get into regular decision, they have a chance to analyze, okay, who did we already bring in? What are we missing at this point? We've already made a commitment to 800 kids through our early decision admissions process. We have 800 more slots. And in order to fill those 800 slots, we need to probably accept 1,600 kids. What are we short on right now? What do we need? And they may go heavy to those groups in the regular decision pool. We have no idea what each school is going to do. And we just have to respect the fact that schools are going to make decisions that are best for them. My dad used to say to me, and he was a very smart guy, and he used to say, Johnny, all you can do is your best. All you can do in this life is you do your best, you give your all, and that's good enough. And whatever comes your way, it will be more than good enough. So if you've got a young person who has done really well in school and has applied to a nice range of schools, schools that really fit within what they're looking for, the gestalt of the academics and the personal, and they get at least one offer that's affordable, well, you know what? They hit the jackpot. That's how people should be looking at this process.
So, John, another thing you said to me recently when we were talking is people need to get liberated from a T20 mentality. Why don't you explain what you meant by that?
Well, a family, and this is going to be, I think, when you hear the expression, when a family sits down with a counselor and says, I want a T20 school, that's coming from the parent. 99.99% that's coming from the parent and not from the kid. And that's a helicopter parent. And that's a parent who basically has their own idea as to what will be best for my child and what will make me as a parent look good, and feel good about myself and be able to project this good feeling to my friends at the country club, let's say, and that's going about it all wrong. I mean, I think that in my opinion, Mark, that poisons the process. It poisons the well from the very start of the process. And I would shut that down immediately. I would say, you know what? This is not your process. This is your kid's process. Now let's look at this another way. What is it that the young person is looking for their college experience? Let's make a list of things that are important to them. And let's build a list from that, because it's the kid that's got to go for 4 years. I mean, if you're going to start with a T20 mentality, you're not allowing your child to become empowered in this process in any way whatsoever. They are surrendering their hopes and their dreams and their aspirations to their parents. And that's crazy. That's like letting the lunatics run the asylum. You can't let that happen. And my guess is that as someone who does this work regularly, and I know that you do it brilliantly, you must have this, you must have very hard, honest conversations, a little bit of kindness, a little bit of stick, a little bit of carrot and stick with these parents to say, look, this is your kid's process. And unless we involve them in this process, we can't even start this process,
So here's where it gets tricky. There'll be a lot of parents who went to those schools because it was so much easier to go to in the day. I mean, it's unbelievable when I look back and I see admit rates early 90s over 60% at places like Hopkins and WashU. Now it's closer to a tenth of that. And, U Chicago, Penn, mid 30s not that long ago. So a lot of parents have gone to those places and they will say, and I know they're telling the truth, I know for a fact that it's helped me in my career because people have made comments about it. So why should I not want that for my kid? I'm just trying to give my kid a leg up because I know for a fact that it's helped me. What would you say to that, John?
Well, I mean, I think it's important for students to have a range of schools that they apply to. There is no reason that a kid can't have one or two high reaches on their list. I mean, the Common App allows us to apply to 20 schools. I mean, that's a lot. But it can be done if you start in August, and I think it can be done well. But what I would say is that you can't have too many of those T20 schools on the list, because that's going to diminish your chances for admission at schools that are really within your range. Because even if you have that straight A average and that 1,500 score, you're not in range at those top schools, because those top schools are basically 95% of their applicants look just like you on paper. And I think that's what a lot of parents don't understand. They look at their kid and they're saying, okay, Mark, my kid's got a 4.0. My kid's got a 1520 or 1540. It puts them in the top 1% on testing. They have a 4.0. It puts them in the top 5% of their class. These are the stats when I look at the T20 colleges. These are the stats that those schools are using to accept their students. But they're turning down as many of those kids or more than they're accepting. So I think what you have to do is you have to inform parents that, sure, you went to Penn, definitely let's put Penn on the list. But let's also make sure that we have a lot of range schools and safety school and likely schools that your child will be really excited to attend if Penn doesn't come through. I mean, I think that's the key. The key is balance. Having a list with only T20 schools is totally unbalanced, completely and totally unbalanced.
Yeah, I think the key is balance, but I'm going to go a step further because there's a lot of people who understand they can't have an entire list of Reach for All schools. So they realize they need to have others. But the mentality is, oh my goodness. I mean, this, it's not said this way, but all the actions indicate, oh my goodness, it would be a disaster if they ended up at a probable or a likely.
That's where I see the bigger problem. Not so much, I do see a problem with people having total top-heavy lists. But I also see a problem with people throwing on some probables and likelies, but it's like the end of the world if that's where my kid actually ended up. Getting to the point where you could embrace it as a place where a student could go have a great experience and have an amazing career, that's where I see the ball gets dropped. Any suggestions or tips around that?
Well, Mark, I think that you are very knowledgeable about this stuff, and you can look at an individual student, and you can look at what they're bringing to this process. It's kind of like my dad, who was a cardiologist. He could look at an electrocardiogram and know in 1 second what the problem was, and he had a gift for that. You have a gift for being able to look at the totality of what a young person brings to the application process. And you know instantaneously where they're going to be competitive, where they're going to be very competitive, and where they're not likely to be very competitive.
I'm thinking though, John, we have a tremendous amount of people that are using the podcast to do it themselves. You know what I mean? That's who I'm trying to speak to. Not the person that gets professional assistance, but the person that's trying to do it themselves. And I don't know, any tips?
Well, I think there are a few. I think the first one is to own the reality of modern day college admissions, knowing that a lot of these T20 schools or T10 schools are only taking 5% of their applicants. And that most of the kids that are applying to these schools have profiles very similar to their own kid, which would then mean that their chances are like 1 in 20 to gain admission. They have to own that. That is a fact. That is reality.
Friends, this concludes the first part of my 3-part interview with my friend John Hoffman. We hope you join us next week for the second part. On Thursday's episode, Susan and I continue our conversation. Liam Knox, in his excellent article on Stephen Bird's new book, Lifting the Veil, taking a look at enrollment management and answering the question, is it to blame for so many of the problems colleges are facing? Part 2 of 2. And Julie and I will take on scholarship displacement. As a listener sent in a question on that, we'll tackle what is scholarship displacement. And then we'll transition and we will have our final part of our interview with our homeschool experts, Dr. Michelle Livard, Holly Ramsey, and Liam Knox, looking at how college admission offices evaluate homeschool applicants. And then we'll have part 2 of 3, Kevin Newton breaking down the London School of Economics, LSE. And friends, remember, college is not a prize to be won. College is a match to be made. See you on Thursday, friends, and enjoy the rest of your Memorial Weekend. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Rouff, Dr. David Williams, Lynda Doepker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com.
Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.